Imagine a tiny, almost invisible difference between two atoms. A difference so small, yet it dictates whether we power a city or maybe build a weapon. That's the kind of mind-bending reality we're talking about with uranium. And today we're doing a deep dive into how we manipulate it. Specifically, the incredibly complex, high-stakes process of uranium enrichment. Our mission really is to unpack the science, the methods, the huge challenges, and the global implications, especially its significance for energy and geopolitics right now in 2025.
It really is fascinating, isn't it, how such a subtle thing, just a tiny difference in atomic mass, creates this, well, monumental impact. Global energy, national security, it's all tied up in this. We're going to
Oh,
trace that journey from raw ore, stuff buried deep underground, to becoming this highly specialized fuel. And along the way, we'll see the ingenuity involved, definitely, but also, yeah, the inherent risks that come with this kind of powerful technology.
okay, so let's open this up a bit. Natural uranium.
Oh.
It's not just one single thing, is it?
No, not at all. It's mainly two isotopes. You've got uranium-238, which is like 99.3% of the stuff you find naturally. And then there's the star player, uranium-235. That's just a tiny fraction, about 0.7%.
Right, and as you probably know listening to this, that 0.7%, it's not just important, it's basically the spark that started the nuclear age. It's the only natural isotope we can reliably split to keep a nuclear chain reaction going, releasing all that energy.
Exactly. The U-238, the common stuff, it doesn't really fission in the same way. It's called fertile because, well, it can absorb a neutron and eventually turn into plutonium-239, which is fissile. But U-238 itself doesn't sustain that chain reaction directly.
So we're basically looking for this incredibly rare fissile needle in a massive U-238 haystack, 99.3% haystack.
That's the core challenge, yeah. How do you isolate it? And not just isolate it, but significantly boost its concentration. That's enrichment. For most power reactors, we need what's called low-enriched uranium, LEU. That's typically around 3 to 5% U-235.
Okay, 3 to 5%,
Yeah.
still way up from the natural 0.7%.
Way up. But then, for nuclear weapons, or even some specialized research reactors, you need highly enriched uranium, HEU, that's usually defined as over 20%. But for weapons, you're often talking 90% U-235 or even higher.
90%, wow.
And the whole process amazingly hinges on exploiting that tiny, tiny mass difference. U-235 is just slightly lighter than U-238, 3 atomic mass units difference. Sounds simple when you say it like that, but doing it, that demands incredibly sophisticated, demanding technology.
Absolutely. And the whole journey, it's definitely not simple. It literally starts in the ground.
Right. Mining the ore first.
That raw uranium ore has to be mined. Then it's processed into uranium oxide, that stuff often called yellow cake.
Yep, U-308.
From there, it gets converted into a gas uranium hexafluoride, UF6, and then, only then, can the actual enrichment really start.
Mhm.
So yeah, this journey starts deep in the earth. Before we even think about atoms, we have to dig this stuff out of rock. And the ore itself is usually really low grade, often less than 1% uranium. We're talking huge amounts of rock to get started.
Huge amounts. And the big players, globally, Kazakhstan, Canada, Australia, they account for something like 70% of world production now in 2025.
According to the World Nuclear Association.
Yeah.
Yeah. So after mining, the ore gets crushed, treated chemically, and you end up with that yellow cake powder you mentioned, U-308. It's much more concentrated, maybe 80, 90% radium by weight.
Okay.
But critically, it's still got that natural 0.7% U-235. No enrichment yet.
Exactly. That initial stage is just fundamental. It's about standardizing the material, cleaning it up, getting it ready. You can't just, feed raw rocks into an enrichment plant. It needs precise preparation. It really sets the stage for the tricky part.
Right, got that solid foundation. Okay, so we have the yellow cake. The next big step is turning it into that gas, uranium hexafluoride, UF6. Why UF6?
UF6 is key. It's pretty much the only uranium compound that becomes a gas at relatively low temperatures, around 56 Celsius, what's that, 133 Fahrenheit? And you need it to be a gas for the enrichment methods we use. That lets you exploit those tiny mass differences between the isotopes.
Makes sense. So you need specialized facilities for this conversion step.
Definitely. Big industrial plants like Orano over in France or Converdin here in the US, they handle this complex chemical conversion, turning solid yellow cake into the gaseous UF6 feedstock. Ready for the main event.
Okay, preparation's done. UF6 gas is ready. Now we hit the core challenge.
Yeah.
How do you actually separate U-235 from U-238?
Yeah.
This is where the real ingenuity and, the high stakes come in. Historically, there was gaseous diffusion, right?
Right, the old workhorse. Incredibly energy hungry.
Yeah, forcing UF6 gas through membranes, hoping the lighter U-235 sneaks through a tiny bit faster. But that's pretty much history by 2025.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
Gaseous diffusion was, well, a brute force method, a real energy hog. We're talking something like 4,000 kilowatt hours for every unit of enrichment work, what we call an SWU. It's just not economical anymore. Plants like Paducah in Kentucky, they're long closed.
Hmm.
What dominates now is far more elegant, far more efficient gas centrifuges.
Right. Centrifuges. These sound like marvels of engineering. How do they actually work? How do they pick out that rare U-235?
Well, you feed the UF6 gas into these very tall, very slender cylinders, and these things spin incredibly fast,
How fast are we talking?
between 50,000 and 70,000 RPM revolutions per minute. The tips of the rotors inside are actually moving faster than the speed of sound.
Wow, supersonic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that incredible spin generates immense centrifugal force. It pushes the slightly heavier U-238 molecules out towards the cylinder wall, while the slightly lighter U-235 molecules, they tend to concentrate more towards the center. So you basically draw off the U-235 richer gas from the center and the U-238 heavier or depleted stream from near the wall.
Okay, but that can't be enough in one go, right? You
Right.
can't just spin it once and get reactor fuel.
No, definitely not. Each centrifuge only increases the U-235 concentration by a very small amount, a tiny fraction.
Yeah.
So to get to your target, say that 35% LEU for a reactor, you need thousands of these centrifuges, all connected together in series and parallel. We call them cascades.
Cascades.
Yeah, the slightly enriched output from one centrifuge or one stage of centrifuges becomes the input for the next stage.
Hmm.
And you keep doing that, maybe 10, 20 stages, sometimes more, gradually increasing the concentration. The beauty of centrifuges is that efficiency, though. They use maybe 50 times less electricity than the old diffusion method.
50 times less. That's huge.
It's why they dominate. They produce something like 80% of the world's commercial LEU. You've got big players like Urenco in Europe, Rosatom in Russia. But while they're efficient, they are incredibly demanding. Precision engineering is critical. You need
Yeah.
advanced materials like special high-strength steel called miraging steel, because even a tiny imbalance in a rotor spinning that fast, it could fly apart catastrophically, releasing that nasty UF6 gas. So maintenance, managing potential leaks, it's a constant challenge.
And of course, the big one. They can be used for peaceful power, but
Also for weapons material. That's the dual-use problem. It's inherent in the technology, and it's why there's so much international scrutiny and concern around centrifuge plants.
which kind of leads us to the next thing. The sort of emerging frontier in enrichment. Laser enrichment. Specifically, silex.
Ah, yes. Separation of isotopes by laser excitation. It does sound a bit sci-fi, doesn't it? Using light to pick out atoms.
How does that work?
It's actually quite clever. You use lasers that are tuned to a very, very precise frequency, a frequency that only excites the U-235 molecules in the UF6 gas. The U-238 molecules are left untouched, essentially. This excitation changes the chemical properties of the U-235 just enough so you can separate them from the unexcited U-238.
And the advantages are?
Potentially significant. It could be even more efficient than centrifuges, less energy, maybe fewer stages needed. There are companies like Global Laser Enrichment, GLE in the US, that are actively trying to commercialize this right now in 2025.
But there have to be challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely. The setup costs are apparently very high. The tech is extremely complex. But the really big concern, the one that gets the non-proliferation folks worried, is the risk. Laser systems could potentially be much smaller, more compact than a huge centrifuge cascade hall. That makes them harder to detect, harder to monitor.
I see. Easier to hide.
Potentially,
Yeah.
which is why the IAEA is watching very closely. There was even a post, I think, on X earlier this year warning that silex could, in theory, sort of democratize enrichment, make it accessible in ways that could really complicate efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons tech.
Right, that's a serious concern. Okay, so assuming we've successfully enriched the uranium using centrifuges or maybe lasers, we've got the UF6 gas at the right concentration. What happens then? How does it become fuel?
Good question. Once you have that enriched UF6, let's say at 35% U-235 for a standard reactor, you actually have to convert it back into a solid.
Back into a solid.
Yep. Back into a powder, specifically uranium dioxide, UO2. This UO2 powder is then pressed into tiny ceramic pellets, like little cylinders. And these pellets are stacked up and sealed inside long tubes made of a special zirconium alloy. These tubes are bundled together to form fuel assemblies.
And those assemblies are what go into the reactor core.
Exactly. Those fuel assemblies are the heart of the most common type of reactors, the light water reactors. And those reactors, well, they generate something like 90% of the world's nuclear electricity, about 440 of them operating in 2025. So yeah, this is where all that complex science literally becomes electricity for millions of people.
Okay. But enrichment isn't perfectly efficient. There's always leftover material, right? The stuff that didn't get enriched.
Right. The byproduct is depleted uranium DU. It's what's left after you've taken out a lot of the U-235. So its U-235 concentration is even lower than natural uranium, maybe down to 0.2 or 0.3%.
And what do we do with all that?
Yeah. Well, some of it gets repurposed. Because it's incredibly dense, much denser than lead, it's used in things like shielding, counterweights, even some military applications like tank armor, sometimes for producing medical isotopes too. But most of it needs to be stored. And managing depleted uranium, especially in its UF6 form, is a real long-term challenge. That depleted UF6 is still chemically hazardous. If it gets wet, it can form hydrofluoric acid, which is seriously toxic stuff.
Likes.
Yeah. So it has to be stored very carefully, usually in large, robust steel cylinders to prevent leaks over decades, even centuries. And the quantities are enormous. The U.S. alone has something like 700,000 metric tons of this stuff stockpiled.
700,000 tons. Okay, so you really start to see this whole process. It's not just chemistry lab stuff. It's huge industrial scale. It's economics. It's global safety, geopolitics, our energy future. The ripple effects are just immense.
They really are. All those technical details we talked about,
Yeah.
they connect directly to these broader world issues. Think about the technical challenges first. That precision engineering for centrifuges, needing exotic materials like miraging steel just to stop them flying apart.
Right.
Even the efficient methods still use a lot of electricity.
Ah.
And the safety aspect. Handling UF6 safely, preventing leaks, protecting workers and the environment from both radiation and chemical hazards. It's a constant focus.
And then, yeah, back to the proliferation elephant in the room.
Yeah.
How do we make sure this technology, which is clearly so powerful, isn't misused?
That is the central question, isn't it? Because enrichment tech is inherently dual use. You can make LEU for reactors, or you can keep going and make HEU for bombs. That's why international controls are so vital. You've got the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and you've got the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, doing inspections and monitoring, trying to put safeguards in place.
But it's still a source of tension, like with Iran's program, right? That's always in the news.
Yeah, exactly. Iran's centrifuge program is a perfect example of a geopolitical flashpoint in 2025. You constantly see chatter, on social media and in diplomatic circles about their enrichment levels. Are they sticking to lower levels, maybe up to 20% for research reactors, as they claim? Or are they pushing towards that 90% weapons grade threshold? It's a constant source of friction and mistrust.
And apart from the security worries, what about the straight-up economic and environmental costs?
Well, anatomically, enrichment isn't cheap. Building and running these facilities costs billions. The capacity is concentrated too, mostly Russia, China, Europe, the U.S. The price for enrichment services, that SW mentioned, maybe $100 to $150 per SW today. And a big reactor needs about 100,000 SWs worth of enrichment every year just for its fuel reload. So big money involved.
Hands up quickly.
Yeah. And then environmentally, beyond the mining impact, you've got that huge issue of storing the depleted uranium tails for the very long term. That carries costs and responsibilities for generations.
Okay, so lots of challenges, but let's flip to the positive side too. Despite all this, nuclear power, which relies on this enriched uranium, provides a significant chunk of global electricity, right? About 10%.
That's right, about 10%. And it's a critical source of low-carbon electricity for many countries. Right now, in 2025, the World Nuclear Association says there are 60 new reactors under construction globally. Think about countries like China, India. They're relying on nuclear and thus enriched uranium to meet massive energy demand growth while trying to limit carbon emissions.
So these enrichment facilities, they become really strategic assets on the world stage.
Hugely strategic. Take Russia's Rosatom. They supply something like 35% of the world's enriched uranium market. That gives Moscow considerable geopolitical leverage, especially with all the debate around sanctions in 2025. And you see the reaction the U.S., for example, is pushing hard now to rebuild its own domestic enrichment capacity. Companies like Centrus, partly to reduce that reliance, especially after the Ukraine conflict highlighted the risks.
And what about those newer technologies like the lasers?
Well, if laser enrichment like Silex really takes off commercially, it could lower costs and boost efficiency further. But as we said, that comes with those proliferation worries, smaller plants, harder to track.
Yeah.
It's that double-edged sword again.
Always a trade-off. And underpinning all of this is safety regulation.
Absolutely essential. National bodies like the NRC in the US and the International IAEA, they enforce incredibly strict safety rules. Radiation monitoring, secure transport of UF6, emergency preparedness, all of it. Generally, the public health risks are very low when everything is handled properly, but accidents can happen. That awful criticality accident back in 1999 at Tokaimura in Japan, it's a stark reminder that you need constant vigilance. There's no room for complacency.
So wrapping this up, it's clear that uranium enrichment is, well, just incredibly complex, and the stakes couldn't be higher. It's this amazing, intricate dance between cutting-edge engineering, our planet's massive energy needs, and this constant, really daunting challenge of global security.
It really highlights something fundamental, I think. Scientific progress gives us these powerful tools, amazing potential for energy and innovation, but it always comes with these huge responsibilities, especially when it comes to global security. The power locked in these atoms demands just as much power in our ethical oversight and careful management.
Yeah, well said. And the story here, it's definitely not finished. It keeps evolving. New tech, shifting politics, our relentless need for energy. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How will we balance that growing energy demand against the absolute need for non-proliferation in the years ahead? And hey, if you're like us, if you find this stuff fascinating, if you're always looking for those aha moments that connect the dots, you should definitely check out Mind Expansion Daily. Seriously, it's a fantastic resource for getting smart insights on complex topics like this every single day. Helps you stay informed, feeds that curiosity, much like what we try to do here on The Deep Dive. Join us again next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of knowledge.